Well, good morning again. We're starting a brand new series today from the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel's an Old Testament book. It's written about 500 BC, 600 BC, before Jesus Christ. And so it's an old book. It's been around for forever. In fact, if you are a person of history, you like history, Daniel's an amazing book, because the book of Daniel coincides with so much history that we are familiar with. Daniel's service overlaps the Babylonian Empire, if you're familiar with that, if you've heard about that from maybe when you were in school, or the Persian Empire, or the Medo-Persian Empire. This is where this is all written. And Daniel is in the palace when all this stuff is taking part. And so we've got a lot of history that's woven into the book of Daniel. But within the book of Daniel, it really follows a particular guy. Can you guess what his name is? Yeah, Daniel. I always tell you, the Bible's not a big mystery. You know, usually it's either the guy that wrote it or it's about that guy, right? The book of Daniel. And so in this book of Daniel, we see Daniel, but we also see three other guys that we'll talk about in just a minute this morning. And so the book of Daniel is really an interesting book because it takes place initially in the Babylonian Empire. And when you understand anything about the Babylonian Empire, it was probably one of the most wealthiest, but also one of the most immoral and depraved empires the world has ever seen. You're like, really? Like, yeah. In fact, if you look up the Oxford Dictionary, right, if you go online and find the Oxford Dictionary and you look up Babylon, it's really interesting. The first definition is, well, it was the capital city of the Babylonian Empire between the 6th and 5th centuries BC. But then the secondary definition is a metaphor used to describe any group of people that are wealthy and depraved in their morality. Like, wow, wouldn't you like that? So literally it would be like the people who live in Las Vegas go, whatever happens in Babylon stays in Babylon, because we don't talk about it here. I mean, literally, that's what Babylon was like. And that's what, at least the first part of the book of Daniel, that's where it takes place. And so we understand as we look not only through history, but we combine it with Scripture, and we see what's happening. About 605 BC, there becomes a new king, a new emperor of the Babylonian Empire. His name is Nebuchadnezzar, which, by the way, is an awesome name if you're having a boy. Nebuchadnezzar. You call him Nebi. But he comes to power, and Nebuchadnezzar is not, he's a brilliant man. In fact, he's one of the guys that begins the ironworks, and so their army began to use iron before many other people used it, and so that's why their army was so potent, because their weapons were made of iron versus the bronze weapons, and so they would just literally rout other armies. And so he begins to move across the known world, the Middle East at this point in time, beginning in what is now modern-day Iraq. That's where Babylon was, and they begin to spread out across like locusts across the known world, just defeating. And so not only is he a brilliant man, but he's also a brilliant tactician. If you go and you read some of the history about Nebuchadnezzar and his battles, some of the way that he fought them was just unbelievable, and they actually are studied today in modern military academies for the way that he did some of the things that he did. But the third thing that he was brilliant about was that he was a brilliant administrator. So Genghis Khan, in fact, took some of his ideas later on, obviously after, I don't know, what is that, about the, 1300s, whatever it was. I don't remember where he was. But anyway, and what he did is he would conquer a people, and then he would take tens of thousands of those people, and he would transplant them back into Babylon. And initially they would be captives. But what they would do is they would inculcate them, they would brainwash them into the Babylonian way of thinking. And then one generation later, they're no longer, some captive group. They are now Babylonians. And so you literally have in his empire not just people who were living in the capital city, but if you were smart and you showed an aptitude for being able to understand governing or principles or ideas or management, he would actually bring you into his government. And even though you were born somewhere else, if you showed loyalty to him, he would actually have you as a part of his government. And so it was a brilliant move, because what he was doing is that he was basically making this big melting pot of an empire that was made up of all these different types of groups of people, and they were all loyal to him. It's a brilliant strategy. And so we see Nebuchadnezzar is marching across the Middle East, and he comes to the nation of Israel. And he comes to the capital city of Jerusalem, and he besieges it. He literally surrounds it, and for about a period of 18 months, just destroys the city of Jerusalem. In fact, when we fast forward to the book of Nehemiah, we discover that the entirety of the wall was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and never to be rebuilt because they were such a pain in his butt. And they're like, well, I'm not going to ever let you guys rebuild again. And he destroyed it all. And as a part of that, like I said, he took tens of thousands of young Hebrew boys as captives. And he brings them into his empire. And he says, I'm going to train these guys to become like us. Now, I don't know if you've noticed it or not. I'm sure that you have. And even if you're not a spiritual person, you probably see this too. Our culture continues to shift further and further away from God. It just happens. It's just the way that it is. In fact, a generation ago, the things that your average person would do or the things that your average individual would participate in now are called weird. Why would you have family dinner every night? That's just weird. Why would you go to church? That's just weird. Why would you not do this? That's just weird. And so what was normal 20, 30, 40 years ago is now considered weird. And what was considered like nobody did it except for the people that were in prison and the depraved and the absolute nut jobs now is considered normal. And so our culture is moving further and further away from God. Now, pause for just a moment because I'm sure you're sitting there going, yeah, Dave, get him. No. Because this is not new. This isn't a new thing. This isn't just our generation. And I know if you're young enough, you're probably thinking that. If you're old enough, you're going, the rapture's coming any time now because everything's falling apart. It has been falling apart since the moment that Adam stood there quietly as Eve ate the fruit. That has when it all started, and it's all fallen apart since then. There's nothing that is happening today that hasn't already happened before. It's just reality. So we're not going to stand up here and go, yeah, the culture is terrible, because the culture is always going to be terrible. That's just the way that it is. The difference is that the people who are supposed to help revive the culture, which, by the way, that would be those that follow Jesus Christ, have stopped doing what they've done in the past. So if you want to blame somebody, look to the person you're right and say, it's all your fault. No, don't do that, because then they'll be like, okay. But really, that's what it boils down to. And that's why we're doing this series. Because the reality is that if you follow Jesus Christ, if you believe in God, it is our responsibility, it is our duty, it is our goal when we follow Jesus Christ on certain things to stand for the truth and be tough as nails. And listen, if somebody doesn't serve you because you got a Christian t-shirt on, don't post on Facebook, I was persecuted this week, I didn't get my rolls at O'Charlie's because I had my friendship shirt on. No, you're probably being rude or they were having a bad day, okay? That's reality. So the truth is that we are called to actually change the temperature of our culture. Daniel was immersed in this. I mean, you talk about being immersed. He's probably 16, 17, 18 years old. That's how old he is. He is taken from his family. At 16, 17, think about your kids that are 16, 17, and 18 years old. And if they were taken from you and put in an environment where everything was acceptable, you can do anything you want to. In fact, because you were one of the smart ones, in fact, we're going to see in just a little bit, they were smart, good-looking, and had an aptitude for learning. They were the gold stars, right? They were the guys. They were the Jewish boys. When they would walk down the street, all the girls would be like, that's who these guys were. And they were put in this environment, and they were literally set up to fail, but to fail the way that they wanted them to fail and become Babylonians. So let's look at this real quick because we're going to start in Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 through 7. the king, that's Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, and that was his chief of security. That was the guy that was responsible for everything, his chief of staff, his prime minister, the guy that was kind of in charge of everything, all the details of life. He says to Ashpenaz this, he has his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family. So now, not only do we know that Daniel and his three friends, not only are they good looking and they're smart, they've got an aptitude for learning, but they actually have royal blood in them. They're like two, right? So there we go. He says, and other noble families who have been brought to Babylon as captives. And he says, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. And all the single ladies said, yes. Make sure that they are well-versed in every branch of learning. Now listen, this is very important. He says, make sure that they are well-versed in every branch of learning and gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and the literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. Now, think about this. Can you imagine a group of, 200, 300, 16, 17, 18-year-old boys that are taken from their families, they're put in a palace environment, and they're given awesome food, they're given wine, they go to school, they have fun, they're like, what do you want? We'll give it to you. What do you need? We'll find it for you. And can you imagine, I think within the culture of Babylon, this group was probably pretty whack, right? They were probably doing some things that they should not have been doing because all the bars and all the withholding has been removed. Kind of sounds like college, doesn't it? So, the king assigned them a daily ration of food for his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years. Yeah, it does sound like college. And then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. So King Nebuchadnezzar brings them and says, guys, this is what we're going to do. We're going to rewire how they think. We're going to teach them our ways. We're going to show them that what we do and how we do it is better than the way they used to do it. We're going to instill in them our cultural biases. We're going to immerse them in our culture so that what they see as a shock initially is now normal and commonplace. We're going to change their clothing. We're going to even try to reorient their taste buds. Now, have you ever traveled outside of the United States and eaten food from a different country? Now, I'm not talking like Mexico because their food rocks, okay? But some of these places that you travel to are weird. The things that they eat are strange. So can you imagine coming from a Jewish home where pork isn't served and, you don't eat on certain days of the week, and then you've got the Sabbath and all these different things that take place, and now you're put into this environment where not only are you given anything you want to eat, but the things that you're given to eat have been sacrificed to idols and blessed to idols. And so essentially, as you eat that, you're doing an act of worship. That's what the whole context of all this is. And so it's all force-fed to them. And then he goes, now, that's not enough. We got to do one more thing. We need to change your name. Because the names that you've been given don't fit who we are. And somehow they determined that 3 years was the appropriate amount of time for the full indoctrination and assimilation into them being full-fledged Babylonians. And the last piece of the puzzle was changing their names. Now, it's really interesting when we look at the names of what they mean. Daniel's name means God is my judge. Hananiah's name means Yahweh, or God is gracious to me. Mishael's name is who is like our God. And Azariah's name means Yahweh has saved me. Now look at their 3 names, because this is so cool. Their 3 names together mean God is the ultimate judge who is gracious to me. There is no one like God, and yet he has still saved me. What a cool statement, right? And in fact, as you read through the book of Daniel, do you know what the major themes are? That God is the ultimate judge, that when we humble to him, that he is gracious, that there is no one like the real God, and if you turn to God, God will save you. Those themes are constant throughout the book of Daniel because these guys said, you know what? We are not going to absorb our new names. We're to continue to be who God's called us to be. You can call us whatever you want. We can't control that. But we're not going to assume a name that God hasn't given us. Because look at what the names that they're attempted to be given mean. Look at this. Belteshazzar means that Bel, one of their gods, protects the king. He says, listen, I know that your name means God is the ultimate judge, but I'm going to tell you this. The king is the ultimate judge, and our God protects the king. So we're going to change that name because that's not really what it's all about. And then Shadrach's new name means, I am inspired by Aku. Sounds like you're sneezing, doesn't it? But that's one of their gods. Hey, listen, you are no longer to think about the fact that your God is gracious to you. I want you to understand that you are inspired by Aku. He is the one that gives you the inspiration to do all the things that you do. He is the one that's working through you. That is your new name. The third one for Meshach is not only are we inspired by Aku, but I belong to Aku. I am the property of Aku. And then Abednego says, I am the servant of Nego. 3 different gods of the Babylonian Empire. And so they literally try to change everything about them, and they come to their names and they say, listen, we're going to change your names because every one of your name references one of your gods, because they thought that there were multiple, but they said, listen, the Lord of Israel is one God. There's only one. They go, that's fine, whatever. We're still going to change your name because our gods are better than your gods. And we don't want you to think about those things. We don't want you to focus on those things. We want you to focus on our gods and do what we tell you to do. So going from their combined names saying God is the ultimate judge who is gracious to me, he has no equal, yet he still chooses to save me. Now their combined name says Bel is the strongest protector of the king. I am inspired and I belong to Aku, and my greatest desire is to serve Nego. See, the desire was to change their very identity, to change who they were. And that is something that hasn't changed since the beginning of time. Because Satan knows if he can change your name, if he can give you a name that God hasn't given you, it infects and it impacts every area of who you are. Maybe when you were younger, and I know when you're younger, for some reason, names tend to hurt more, don't they? Somebody called you a name, and that you absorbed it. You're like, yep, that's who I am. I'm dumb. I'm ugly. I'm fat. I'm weird. I'm not accepted. I'm not a part. And so you let that become a part of who you are. And so you begin to act that way. You begin to live that way. So here's the big idea for today. If I assume a name that God hasn't given me, then I'll miss the life that God has for me. If I assume a name that God hasn't given me, then I'll miss the life that God has for me. I think it is so cool that as the book of Daniel is written, those 4 things, their 4 names, are part of the major themes throughout the entire book. That God is the ultimate judge, that he is gracious to us, that he is the one that saves us. All throughout that book we see it. In fact, it's so cool. Every time one of the Babylonian gods is raised up, or there's an idol or a statue, we'll see that next week, that's built. It's like, you're going to worship the king like he's God, and they refuse to do that. All this stuff happens. The king, the ruler, whoever it is, comes back and goes, you know what? I was wrong. There is no one like the God of Israel. There's no one like him. Like, he is the God. And so this theme is reverberates throughout the entire book of Daniel, because these guys in this moment said, we're not going to allow that to change us, because God gave us these names and we are going to be who God calls us to be. So how do we do that today? How do we do that? How do we be who God has called us to be? The first thing we need to do is we need to realize that when culture shifts, that we need to stand with grace. When culture shifts, and I wrote these kind of in a first-person thing so that you can kind of internalize it, right? So when culture shifts around me, I'm going to stand with grace. Now, this is super important, the last part, because you probably know people who stand as idiots. Do you not? Right? Like, let me just tell you. Can I say something to you just really quickly? We'll talk about this in a couple of weeks. But you realize that the louder you get, the less you're heard. You ever thought about that? Do you pay attention to the guy screaming on the street corner? I mean, outside of going, I'm going to go on the other side of the street. He's lost his marbles. But standing with grace, because standing is important. We can agree to that, correct? It's important to stand. But you realize that how you stand impacts what you're standing for. People sometimes stand, but the way that they stand causes you to have that gag reflex. And I don't want any part of what they are. And do you realize that's why a lot of people are turned off to God? It has nothing to do with God. It has to do with those of us who represent Him and how we handle ourselves. So we need to stand with grace. Now, I don't know all your stories, but I'm pretty sure I can say this with great ease. You've not been kidnapped from your home, taken to a foreign land, put in an environment where everything was acceptable, having your name changed, your clothes changed, your taste books changed, your brain rewired, and put in that environment. I am pretty safe, I think. Now, if you're like, oh, no, that's happened to me, shoot me an email. Kate at experiencefriendship.com. Kait at experiencefriendship.com. Now, look at their response when all this happens. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine that was given to them by the king. Now, I know this seems kind of weird. The reason this matters is because for a Jewish person, what you eat was really important. God had set up some dietary restrictions, and part of that process was their worship to God, trusting and believing that what God said was mattered and was important, and they wouldn't deviate from that. So that was part of it. The other part of it was a cultural thing, because they would literally take all of their food and they would sacrifice it to their idols, their gods, and then they would eat it, and in that eating, it was an act of worship to their gods. And so Daniel goes, listen, I can't do that. You are asking me to be someone that God has not called me to be. And I can't do that. So what Daniel did is he sat down and he wrote a really nasty Facebook post, but he didn't put anybody's names on it. He just said, someone in the castle is trying to force me to eat food that I shouldn't eat. Clearly, they don't love Jesus. He went on a rant, pitched a fit, threw himself on the floor, stood in the middle of the thing, screaming on top of the thing. We don't see that, do we? Look at this. He asked the chief of staff for what? You know what he just did there? He recognized him as an authority figure, even though he was asking him to do something that violated his spiritual walk. But he still recognized him as an authority over him. And so he asks permission. Does it say he demanded? Did he write a strongly worded letter? He simply asks permission to not eat these unacceptable foods. He didn't demand it as if it was right. He didn't holler as if he was spoiled. He didn't write a scathing post. He simply, politely asked for permission. And I love Ashpenaz's response. If you want to read it later, it's so cool. Ashpenaz goes, dude, I like you guys, you know. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Hananiah, Mishael, whatever names you guys want to choose, whatever. I like you guys. You're my buds. But here's the thing. If I don't feed you this food and all you eat is veggies, because that's what they decided to do, you are going to look sickly. You are going to be pale. You're going to look like you live in Michigan. And so what we're going to do, all right? Okay. What we're going to do is if I do that and you stand before the king, you know what he's going to do? He's going to separate my head from my body. He's going to kill me. So I love you guys. Ain't happening. So Daniel goes, I totally get that, and I don't want you to lose your head because that would be a bad thing. Most people don't survive that. So here's what we're going to do. Test us for 10 days. It's just 10 days. That's not going to be a negative thing. Just give us water and the veggies for 10 days. And then you devise some test, whether it's physical or mental or emotional, whatever. You devise some test, and if we're the same as or better than, you let us keep doing this. But if we are worse than, then we'll eat whatever you put before us. Because we don't want you to lose your head. Can you imagine the response that he got? Because you can think, right? You're assuming that they're going to be all angry and mad. And he goes, listen, okay, test us. So here's a side note for you. When you stand with grace and you're tested, don't pitch a fit. Because that is God's way of proving that what you're doing is correct. Because testing, the Bible tells us, produces perseverance within us. And perseverance produces strength. And strength produces endurance. And so that's the thing that's going on here. They're like, test us and see if it works. Because here's the thing. When you stand, whether you stand with grace or you don't stand with grace, when you stand, you are being countercultural. Which means you stick out like a sore thumb. So when you do that, don't go, I don't know why people are picking on me, because you are standing. So when you stand, realize testing is going to come. But if you stand for the right thing in the right way, after the testing is over with, God will show himself strong. And so that comes to part number 2. Don't just stand with grace. Daniel chapter 1, verses 14 and 16. So he agreed to this. And he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier. In fact, it actually says they were fatter. That's the actual translation. They were fatter. Now, we think fat, we're like, that's not healthy. Back then, it's like if you were fat, you were healthy and rich because you had more than enough food than you needed. So listen, those of you like, hey, I must be really rich. Okay, so they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who ate all the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Now, I know you're like, that's not much of a benefit. I'd rather have the steak than the carrots. But what God does is he shows that standing with grace produces great benefits. In fact, we're going to fast forward because the next thing is when you stand out, you need to actually shine with humility. When culture shifts, we need to stand with grace. And when we stand counterculturally, guess what? We are going to stand out. And when you begin to shine because you have stood out, do so with humility. Have you ever met someone that does something great and other people go, wow, that's so great? And instead of a humble response, they have an arrogant response. You're like, well, did you think anything different? Don't you just want to slap them right there? Like, seriously. Like, I'm giving you a compliment. Stop being that way. Like, well, whatever. And so when that happens, shy with you, I used to tell our girls all the time, because especially they would share with us things that are going on and the people that they would work with and how they're doing just enough to get by. And I said, that's really terrible that understanding and that work ethic has kind of disappeared over the generations and doing those things, but it's really cool for you. I really love the fact that you guys are getting to grow up in that because you can just do the normal and it looks like you're shining and being awesome. You ever thought about it that way? You see, if you just do what you're expected to do without complaining and whining, you become employee of the month 12 months out of 12. Because you're just doing what you're expected. When you go above and beyond, then you really shine. And you have to remember that the reason that you're shining is not because of how great you are, because of how awesome God is. Every single time Daniel or Hananiah or Mishael or Azariah stood out, their first response was, hey, whoa, time out. It's not about us. It's about how great of a God we serve. And when you stand with grace and you shine with humility, people actually then go, well, I'd actually like to learn more about your God, instead of being repelled. Daniel chapter 1, verses 17 through 20. We're going to fast forward 3 years. Now, God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. In other words, they were the top of their class. So not only are they royalty, not only are they good looking, not only are they strong and handsome and all that stuff, but they're the smart kids in the class. Sometimes it's just not fair, is it? And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. And when the training period ordered by the king, 3 years, completed, the chief of staff, Ashpenaz, brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar, and the king talked with them each. And no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the royal service. So they stood out above all the other guys. He goes, man, these 4 guys, there is something different about them. And then look at this next verse. Because do you remember how many days was it that they said, test us? How many days? Remember? 10. And whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them, how many times? 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. So here's a total side note. It's not on your notes, but write this in the side because I think this is really important to understand. The temperature of your testing results in the temperature and the level of your blessing. When the testing is harder, it's because the blessing is greater. When it's rougher to go through, that means the blessing is more enjoyable to enjoy. They were 10 times, and that's not like a mistake put in there. God intentionally put it in there. He could have easily just gone, you know what, they were tested for a few days and they were a few ways better. He goes, listen, they were tested for 10 days, and because they were willing to stand with grace, I blessed them with 10 times the wisdom and intelligence, and they were loved by the king because they shone or shined with humility. God's favor rested on them not because or before they took a stand. God's favor rested on them after they took their stand. Throughout the entire rest of the book of Daniel, whenever Daniel is interpreting dreams, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walk out of the fiery furnace, we'll talk about that next week, or after Daniel is pulled up unscathed from the lion's den, there's no hint of arrogance or superiority or even condemnation for those around them. They just simply say it's because of God. At every opportunity, they deferred praise back to God. They deferred honor and glory back to God because He was the one that did it all. But it all started because they were unwilling to simply assume the name that the culture was trying to give them. They refused to change their identity to flow with everyone else. But they didn't do it with arrogance, and they didn't do it with annoyance. They stood with grace, and they shined with humility. So as a wrap up, are you going to be someone that sets the culture around you or simply reflects the culture? Are you going to be someone that changes the world or allows the world to change you? It all begins with this first step: refusing to accept any name, label, or identity that God hasn't given you. Because the Word of God tells us that when you accept Jesus Christ, you are a child of the King. You are an overcomer. You are innocent, and you are precious in the eyes of God. You are so valuable that God would sacrifice His one and only Son to pay for all of your sin and all of your shame and all of your past and all of your regrets and all of your mistakes. That is how God sees you, and that is the name that He gives you. So do not accept any name that tries to tarnish who God has called you to be, because that, my friends, is how it starts. So stand with grace and then shine with the humility that God has given you. Father God, we thank you so much for the examples that you give us in Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael. God, these four young men that were dropped in the middle of a culture that was just completely salted with sin and rejection of you and idolatry and immorality and debauchery, all these different things. And God, into that environment, somehow, they were able to be determined in their spirits to not become something that reflected what was around them, but that elevated what was around them. God, in fact, we see that there are people that come to you because of their standing with grace and their shining with humility. God, I know that there are people here today, right now, even in this very moment, who they know that there's something in their brains and in their lives, maybe it's in their families or in their work environment or the friends that they have. They know that there is something that they should be standing for, but they have been afraid to stand because they don't want to stand out, so they don't stand up. So God, I pray for each and every person here that loves you, that wants to follow you. I pray that you would give us the ability to just take a deep breath and to make that stand. Say, okay, God, today's the day. I'm going to stand, and I'm going to stand with grace. And then when I start to stand out because I stand up, I'm going to give you the glory. I'm going to give you the honor. And I'm going to shine with humility. I'm going to shine the light on you so that others would come to know you and say, yes, I want to follow that God because he is the ultimate judge. There is no one like him. He is gracious to me, and he will save me if I return to him, God. And I thank you for that. And I pray this in the awesome, the holy name of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen.